Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Todd Spitzer. I'm the Orange County District Attorney, and this morning we're here to announce the arrest of James Allen Neal, a 72-year-old, who also goes by the name James Allen George Layton. He's being charged with murder and two special circumstances. He's also being charged with murder, kidnapping with the intent during the commission of the murder, and also willful, deliberate, and premeditated an act during the murder of a lewd and lascivious act upon a person of a child under the age of 14 in violation of Section 288. To discuss the case this morning, I'd like to introduce the members of both the law enforcement community and the district attorney's office who are joining me on the stage today, as well as an elected official. We have Brad Avery, a council member from the city of Newport Beach, Chief John Lewis from the city of Newport Beach, Jay Short, Deputy Chief of Newport Beach Police Department, Sean Nelson, Chief Assistant District Attorney, Paul Walters, Chief of the Bureau of Investigation, Brahim Beytai, Senior Assistant District Attorney, Allison Jives, Assistant District Attorney, who oversees the Homicide Unit, and Matt Murphy, Senior Deputy District Attorney of the Homicide Unit, who will be prosecuting this case. The defendant, James Allen Neal, was arrested this week, and he is presently in the state of Colorado, where he was living. He is still there. We do not know if he's going to waive extradition. If he does, then he should be here potentially sometime this week. If he doesn't, then of course that will be a prolonged deliberation, and we will advise you when he might be transported to California. This is a really bittersweet moment for me, quite frankly, as a district attorney. This is a murder that occurred in 1973. It was a kidnapping, as I indicated, for both sexual acts and eventually resulted in an 11-year-old girl dying. Very, very famous case in the sense that people in the city of Newport Beach have been following this case for literally 45 years. It's bittersweet to me because she was 11 years old when she was killed, and I was 12 years old when she was killed. Just to put this in some perspective, 45 years ago when she was killed was when the Watergate hearings began in our nation's capital. And yet for 45 years, the Newport Beach Police Department never gave up. The detectives dogged this case. The community made sure that justice would be secured. A DNA sample was recovered from the victim at the time of the investigation shortly after her death, and that DNA sample had been put into the CODIS system. However, when that DNA sample was put in the CODIS system, there was not a hit. And so that sample remained in the system for a long period of time. However, because of innovations in science and technology, and the fact that these detectives were using every means available to them, they received a pointer indication through genealogical DNA. And today we're not going to talk about the specifics. We'll be deliberating that and putting that evidence on in court. But as a result of that genealogical submission, they got an indication that James Allen Neal may be the suspect. As a result of surveillance and other traditional detective techniques, they were able to get additional DNA, which resulted in the corroboration of the DNA from the victim's body to the DNA sample that the suspect left in a particular location during surveillance activities. When I was a kid, I went to a funeral for one of my cousins, and he died before his mom did. And I think there's a little axiom for those of us who are parents or have loved ones No child should predecease a parent. And yet, this victim, her parents both died before we could bring this good news to them. She is survived by 2 sisters, and we're in touch with both of those individuals, and they have been contacted, and they know about the arrest. And Chief can talk about that if you'd like him to. I think we can all expect, and I think we're starting to expect as a society, that some of these old cases are being solved. And I hope that you, as members of the media, and thank you so much for being here today, that you will never, ever, ever take these cold cases for granted. Every single time we solve a cold case, we have an absolute duty to continue to pursue these cases until we can bring a resolution, irrespective of how old they are. But I can tell you through both traditional DNA and through genealogical DNA, we have every opportunity in the world to solve so many of these cold cases that we never had hope in the past of solving. And that is a great thing for our community. And I'm very, very proud of Newport Beach Police Department. I also want you to know about the connection. So when the DNA was gathered from Mr. Neal, he had a connection to Orange County. He did live here in the 70s. He has a connection to Southern California, which is corroborated. And so he went by the name of James Allen George Layton when he lived here. And as a result of an incident in the state of Florida, he subsequently changed his name to James Allen Neal. At this time, I'm going to have Chief of Police John Lewis show you a PowerPoint presentation, and he will specifically discuss the victim herself. And the reason I'm leaving that information to the chief, as opposed to me myself explaining that to you, is because of the deep commitment that the Newport Beach Police Department and the professionalism of that agency had to making sure that this victim and her family saw justice. So please, Chief John Lewis.
Good morning. I'm John Lewis, Chief of Police of the Newport Beach Police Department. We're here today to talk about this little girl, Linda Ann O'Keefe, who was born on May 24th, 1962. On the morning of Friday, July 6, 1973, 11-year-old Linda O'Keefe left her home in Corona Del Mar to attend a day of summer school. After classes had ended at midday, she began to walk home. Linda was last seen talking to a stranger in a van near the intersection of Marguerite Drive and Inlet Drive in Corona Del Mar. Linda never made it home that afternoon. Linda's family checked with friends, with neighbors, but no one could put their mind at ease. They searched the neighborhood and her path home from school to no avail. No one had seen Linda. Then her mother made that call that every parent dreads and told the Newport Beach Police Department that her daughter was missing. Our officers, friends, community members searched for Linda throughout the night and into the next day. It was the next morning, a man found Linda's body. She was lying in a ditch along Back Bay Drive. She'd been strangled. And that day, the search for Linda Ann O'Keefe became the search for Linda Ann O'Keefe's killer. For 45 years, the Newport Beach Police Department continued to search for Linda's killer. Generations of investigators worked on her case. We never gave up. Last July, we shared the facts of this case on Twitter through Linda's story. As many of you saw, we turned this platform over to Linda and told her story through a series of tweets in Linda's voice. In addition to this public awareness campaign, we pursued a number of traditional, just good old-fashioned police work and innovative investigative techniques, including the latest in DNA technology. Our investigators used forensic DNA testing and an online genealogy website to identify the suspect's DNA as being consistent with DNA left at the crime scene. Simply put, our investigators had a lead. Which brings us here. James Neal, now 72 years old, was arrested by our detectives yesterday at 6:29 a.m. Pacific time in Colorado Springs for the murder of Linda Ann O'Keefe. Newport Beach Police Department is committed to the victims of cold case homicides and to their families. We have never forgotten Linda or the tragic events of July 1973. This was a day that made parents in our community think twice before they let their children walk to school, walk out the front door, bike down the street, or play with their friends. Linda's death changed the lives of the O'Keefe family forever when this little girl was taken from them. It rocked their community, and it took root in the hearts of the men and women of their police department. We never, ever forgot Linda's story. Thank you to Linda's family and schoolmates and friends who never gave up hope. And thank you to everyone all over the world who was touched by Linda's story for your thoughts and your prayers for this little girl and the search for her killer. And thank you to everyone who worked on this case throughout the years. Many of them are here today. It's because of you, James Neal is now in custody. In addition to our team at the Newport Beach Police Department, I want to extend our sincere thanks to Parabon Nanolabs and CC Moore, Family Tree DNA, the Orange County Crime Lab, the Orange County District Attorney's Office, the FBI, and our partners in the Colorado Springs Police Department and the El Paso County Sheriff's Department in Colorado. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. So I am just so proud of the law enforcement community, both the District Attorney's Office and Newport Beach Police, and men and women all over this county and really the state and nation who do this kind of work every single day because they believe that justice needs to be served. To speak on behalf of the community, and this, obviously, this death, this murder rocked the city of Newport Beach in a very, very serious way for over 4 decades. I'll call now on Brad Avery, council member, City of Newport Beach, to talk about the city's reaction to this arrest.
Thank you. I'm here on behalf of Mayor Diane Dixon and the people of Newport Beach, City Council. We, first of all, want to thank District Attorney Spitzer and his staff for what they've done and what they will do going forward. And we're so proud of our police department. I can tell you every resident is so proud of our police department. Not that we haven't been all along, but today is something, and it shows their resolve over the years, as you're well aware. And last year we had that extraordinary social media campaign, which I'm sure in some way helped in this, but it also brought the community together. For those of us that were there in 1973, we've never forgotten it. And so the media campaign, I think, really helped for the rest of the community to be aware of this that took place so long ago at a time that was simpler. And we're a little hardened today because times have changed. But back in 1973, this was a huge deal, and it meant so much to the community, and it was such a collective loss. And it was so difficult to reconcile that this case, as time went on, would never be solved. So for this to happen has been absolutely extraordinary for all of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Councilman. All right, at this time, I'd be happy to take questions. Hey, Michelle. But do me a favor. We have a roving mic because we are broadcasting this. So Michelle and then Vicki.
Thank you, Todd. Can you please explain what he was doing in Southern California in the 70s and also touch on the incident in Florida which caused him to change his name?
With respect to what he was doing, I mean, he was growing up here. His family had moved from Chicago. His father came out, I don't know why, maybe for work, but that will be part of our further investigation. He has other siblings, and that's part of our additional investigation as well. And so he was here, and then he left the area shortly after this particular murder.
In the Florida incident?
I can't talk about details. Mr. Murphy will, at some point, be discussing his criminal record in a public forum when it's relevant. But at this time, we're not discussing his criminal history. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering.
Could you just identify yourself?
Sure. Tim Gorin with ABC News. I'm wondering whether Mr. Neal is cooperating and whether he's acknowledged his involvement in any way.
So obviously, some of you have been a little frustrated with my election, that I've made it clear that we're not trying our cases in the media. Any statements or interviews with respect to this particular suspect are part of our evidentiary process, and we're not going to comment what, if anything, he said at this time. To be fair, I personally have not reviewed any of the reports that will be generated as a result of that investigation, but it would be inappropriate for us to discuss that at this time. Vicki?
Vicki Vargas, NBC LA. I think you mentioned that perhaps the chief spoke with some of Linda's family. Would you mind talking about their reaction? I'm assuming these are the sisters, and how they took this news.
Yes, ma'am. As you can imagine, this is difficult news to receive. And as District Attorney mentioned it's bittersweet to hear that, yes, this case has been resolved, but yet it's a reminder of what happened. So it was a difficult conversation for our folks, for me personally. But on one hand, we were grateful that we could have that conversation and provide them with some closure. I'm not comfortable sharing that personal conversation.
Yeah, depending on how this case, let me just talk about that. These charges carry with it life without the possibility of parole at a minimum, and yet death may be a consideration in this case. As a district attorney, we have a process in place by which we would consider death, and I will follow that process. Ultimately, after discussing this case with Mr. Murphy, the defense team that will be appointed, and looking at all the history, I will then make a decision about whether death is appropriate in this case. Because this case, if you were to look up these charges, I should tell you about that. This complaint is under seal for obvious reasons. It's not a public document. Mr. Murphy, at the appropriate time, will ask the court to unseal it, but it's sealed because of the fact that it couldn't be a public document while we were effectuating the arrest. So it is presently sealed, but if you look up the charges, you have to make sure you're not looking at a penal code from today. We have to charge it based upon the penal code from 1973. And if you remember what was happening in the state of California at the time, Rose Bird was on the Supreme Court, and the people of the state of California reinstated the death penalty in 1978 by initiative, and yet the death penalty was deemed unconstitutional in 1972. So I've discussed this with Mr. Murphy, who of course has prosecuted other death cases and has had to deal with this litigation issue because of the similar time frame, and we will be discussing that. I can't tell you with certainty what the position of our office will be, but I can tell you that at least LWOP is the minimum that would be considered in this case. Any other? Yes, ma'am.
I'm Amy Taxon from AP. Can you give us a more specific timeline of when you finally made this genealogical hit? And also, last year you released these sketches that were made kind of on the basis of DNA. Is that the hit you're talking about, or does that have nothing to do with this family DNA? If you could just kind of walk us through.
Amy, I'll let the chief talk about that.
So that's two separate processes. The sketch that we had came from a company called Parabon Labs that was based on a DNA profile. It was a separate process to generate that actual sketch that we sent out than the process that was used to identify this individual. So it was a way to generate what the suspect could potentially look like based on the information that we had.
Amy, use the mic. Like
a timeline,
Right.
when were the sketches compiled in relation to, did you already have this genealogical hit for this person, or that came after, and kind of obviously 45 years, we've had DNA for some time. Like, what made this happen at this time?
Certainly, I understand your question. The information that we put out where we generated the sketch through Paramount Labs, the hit that we had in this case that we had to develop this lead and this pointing to Mr. Neal came after we had generated that sketch.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things to understand is that these detectives were utilizing every resource available to them at the time. Remember, I told you that the DNA sample from the victim had been put into both the CODIS system and the FBI system, and there were no hits. Now, in California, if you know from Prop 69, we can now take DNA upon arrest of certain felonies. But these laws did not exist at the time. So technology is caught up with the law, but while they went out and they did this, they did this profile through images, then they discovered that there was a genealogical hit through one of the genealogical databases. Yes, sir.
Keith Sharon, Orange County Register. Can you estimate, is there any way to estimate how many detectives have worked on this over the years? And could you talk about how it has changed hands, the police behind the scenes?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there's been hundreds of folks that have been involved in this case over the years, and when we look at it as a police department, we look at the initial patrol officers that responded that day in 1976, conducted the neighborhood canvases, the officers that came on the shift that later on that night, and for months and months pursued every lead that we had back 45 years ago. You look at the investigators that have looked at this case and kept it alive over the years. It's been the effort of lifted up by many strong arms over our department for many, many years. So the number, I can't tell you it's exact, but there's certainly significant effort over many years by a number of our folks that contributed to the resolution or to where we are today in this case.
Nicholas Perez, KCI. Did the Twitter campaign play a role in James' discovery and arrest, or did it just draw attention to the case last summer?
Understand, that's fine.
The Twitter campaign did a couple things for us. Now, it didn't necessarily lead to the identification. We, as District Attorney mentioned, it was something that was done through DNA. But what this also did was it created an awareness, a narrative, an emphasis on this case, and it opened some doors for us to have this case pursued with renewed effort. And it was sharing of her story. And we also think, too, with this Twitter campaign, and part of hopefully what we can learn from this tragedy is that maybe, and we will never know who Linda's story touched. It went all over the world. And did it touch someone in another country, in another state, somewhere that was inspired to report something that they thought was wrong or something that they could have had information about, and maybe another cold case that we'll never know about. We think that there may be something to that as well. But to answer your question, it was a combination of the public awareness and also the DNA is what got us here.
Why don't you stay there in case there's
Jill Replogle, KPCC. I have the same question, but also just to be absolutely clear, so Family Tree DNA was the online website?
That's correct.
Right, okay.
And just to clarify on that point, was it a familial DNA hit, or was it the actual suspects uploading his own DNA?
We'll let the district attorney handle that one.
So obviously, we have dealt with different cases, both in Orange County so far and across the state and the nation, both familial and then individual suspects who have submitted their own genealogical. I am not comfortable in discussing that today. I'm going to allow Mr. Murphy to decide when and how he's going to present that in a court of law. And so I apologize, but suffice it to say, for purposes of today, it was the genealogical DNA that was the pointer, but we're not prepared to discuss the details of that at this time.
Can you maybe say how long it was from the point you got the potential DNA hit, whether it was familial or direct?
The hit on the genealogical chip, yeah.
The idea of the suspect?
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Or arrest, I should say.
No, thanks, Chip. The genealogical DNA came back and hit in January. So it was very recent. Michelle?
And I interviewed a teacher yesterday who was attacked by someone 3 months prior. Is there a chance this guy is good for anything else? And what are you doing about that?
So just like any other investigation, obviously when somebody is arrested, it informs the public of potential other victims. Excuse me a second. So we have a recent case that we're working on that somebody through instant messenger Facebook told me directly through my Facebook page that she may be a victim of another case. This happens all the time. So through social media, that's a phenomenal thing. So even though it may not have been absolutely the pointer system with respect to how we got this gentleman arrested, it may help us in our additional investigation. The other thing I'll say to you is, if there's other victims out there, knowing that somebody has been arrested makes people feel they can come forward and be safe because that person's now in custody. As you know, for death penalty consideration, all kinds of factors come into play. And so I'm asking Mr. Murphy and his team that will be taking over this case to look at any and all potential victims to see if there's additional victims that might affect what we ultimately ask for in terms of a penalty in this case.
Do you know what his job was at the time of the abduction?
Construction.
He was in general construction. Tying
into the van, there was in the Twitter campaign mention of this van and witnesses coming forward saying there was a turquoise van talking to a little girl at the time. Is there anything you can link Mr. Neal to this van?
Again, so I personally am familiar with the search, with the affidavit, the arrest warrant. I can tell you that based upon that affidavit, I didn't see anything in there that linked the van. Some witnesses called it blue, some called it turquoise, pretty close. But again, if that is a relevant piece of information, Mr. Murphy will be talking about that in court. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that there was good old-fashioned police work that yielded some supplemental DNA.
Yes.
Can you share any details about what that was and how it was collected?
I can just tell you generically, again, I'm not going to talk about specifics. That's Mr. Murphy's job in a court of law. As a result of genealogical DNA, I want everybody to start using same terms because our office is going to start using this term. It is simply a pointer system. We don't put into evidence from the district attorney's office the evidence coming directly from genealogical DNA. We use our DNA evidence gathering to then give detectives additional leads so they can go out and gather DNA the good old-fashioned way. This arrest was based upon the collection of good old-fashioned DNA through surveillance techniques. And that evidence, I'm not going to be specific, but Mr. Murphy will obviously be discussing that in a court of law.
And was that in January?
No, the genealogical was in January. The genealogical hit was what confirmed Mr. Neal, and then they used that information to locate his whereabouts, Colorado, and then through surveillance and other techniques, they gathered DNA. The DNA that they then subsequently collected through surveillance was then compared to the DNA from the victim, and there was a match.
And when was that gathered? How long ago?
Which one, Michelle?
The one that was gathered through surveillance. Was that within the last?
Very recent.
Yeah, I mean, just within the last weeks.
Hey, Tom.
Yes.
Talk to us at all about the actual arrest, how it went down?
I wasn't there, but I'll ask somebody. Do we have any details?
So there was a lot of planning that goes into a case like this and the actual arrest itself, and we're sincerely grateful to the Colorado Springs Police Department and also the El Paso County Sheriff's Department for our assistance, for assisting us out there in Colorado. But the arrest was unremarkable. It went off without incident.
In what city was the arrest specifically? Colorado Springs?
Colorado Springs.
Let me answer this.
Is he married?
So His marital status and whether or not he had any children or through marriage had children, that could be very relevant to our investigation, so I'm not discussing it.
Can I ask John one more question?
Of course.
John, can you please talk about the fact that that photograph right there, we know hangs in the police department as we speak? And also, just how there were daily reminders of this little girl. Even guys who, 45 years later, who obviously didn't work on the case, they know who Linda O'Keefe is or who she was.
And Michelle, you know how this has touched our community and our department. As I mentioned it, cases like this, as a police officer, you never forget whether or not you were the one that initially came out there to the scene that night, or perhaps you were the detective that inherited the case many years later. But Linda's face and her memory has been with us and our investigators since the day this happened. And her picture hangs in our detective division, where our folks see it every day. As a reminder of her, and a reminder of why it's so important that we continue to pursue these cases and hopefully come to some kind of resolve for the families, for our investigators, but also for our community as well. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, just a quick question. You said he left California shortly after this happened. Did he go only to Colorado? Can you talk about where else he may have lived? Because it's been a really long time, and you've sort of hinted at that you don't have additional victims at this point, but can you just confirm that there are none, or if there are, how many are there?
We're not going to put out any information about whether there are or not additional victims. I don't want to be too generic, but individuals who engage in sexual activity against minors tend to be have certain indicators of a predatory nature. I'm not saying that this is the case here, but we're going to explore every single indicator that's important to me as a district attorney. I want to know if there's any other victims, and I want to be able to use that potentially as evidence in the case in terms of the appropriate punishment. That is a very important issue. So I can't comment on it. I don't even want to infer that it's relevant, but I do want you to know that it's important for part of the analysis. I'm sorry, Amy? After he left California after the murder, he went to Florida, and that's where he changed his name.
And so even though the van may still be in play, anything to kind of put people at ease who were there at that time to explain how he came in contact with her? Was he working in the area? Was there any kind of prior connection? Was he stalking her? Do we know any of that at this point?
Chief, do you have any comments on that?
This is information that we're all working on right now, and understand too, folks, we still have investigators on the ground in Colorado that are still working this. So that type of information, should it be available later, is something with Mr. Murphy's guidance here, would be something we can discuss. But for right now, that's information that we're still working in terms of that actual tie to the community.
But Vicki, to your question about peace of mind in the community, we unequivocally believe, and the reason that criminal charges were filed is that we believe Mr. Neal did this beyond a reasonable doubt. We have no indication that there's a suspect at large who was engaged in the activity except for Mr. Neal. And so we're very, very confident, based upon the DNA, that Mr. Neal is both should be charged with murder as well as the kidnapping and the allegations of sexual assault. All right, last question. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Is there any reason to believe that there was anyone else involved with Mr. Neal, an accomplice or anything of that nature?
Based upon the evidence I reviewed, there's no indication that he acted in concert or this was some kind of conspiracy. Everything indicates he acted alone.
And do we think he lived in Newport, Todd, or he was working that day in Newport?
There's probably some very specific indicators through additional investigation that the detectives and others will be able to gather. But in terms of, we definitely know he resided in the area and he has roots in the area. So it's not as if DNA was collected He was arrested in Colorado, and everybody's like, what is this connection to Southern California and Newport Beach? He absolutely was placed here at the time of the commission of this crime. All right? Thank you very much. I appreciate your attendance today.